Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Suisuiki. Coming up,
it is difficult to verify which one is correct.
More deaths reported in West Papua. Also,
New Zealand is assisting with the limited resources that it does have, but I don't think it's capitalising in its unique set of skills and experience.
Tackling corruption in the Pacific and boosting the sport of rugby in India. Further reports of civilian casualties are coming out of West Papua as clashes between Indonesia's military and the armed wing of the Free Papua movement continue. One of the most recent military operations took place last month in Intan Jaya, Central Papua. Caleb Fotheringham has more.
In a video statement, an Indonesian military spokesperson says 18 members of the West Papua National Liberation Army, or TPNPB, were killed on the 14th of May. The military confiscated an assault rifle, homemade weapons, ammunition, bows and arrows, and the Morning Star flag, a symbol for West Papuan independence. But according to the TPNPB, only 3 of the group's soldiers were killed, with the rest being civilians. A spokesperson from the Embassy of Indonesia, whose statement has been voiced, says no civilians were killed.
The local regent of Intan Jaya has checked for the victims at their homes and hospitals. Therefore, he can confirm that the 18 victims were in fact all members of the armed criminal group.
The spokesperson says the military operation was carried out because residents in the area were being terrorized by the armed group.
The difference in numbers of victims sometimes happens because the armed criminal group tries to downplay their casualties or to try to create confusion.
RNZ Pacific has been sent photos of people who have been allegedly killed or injured in the assault. Jakarta-based researcher with Human Rights Watch, Andreas Hassono, says the Indonesian military claimed that one woman was killed at the hands of the TPNPB.
The TPNPB said, of course, it is a lie. Why should we kill an indigenous woman? Well, it is difficult to verify which one is correct because the battle area are very remote.
He says the latest operation is part of a wider campaign by the military that started last year, but was intensified in April when the TPNPB killed 17 miners. The group accused them of being military informers.
It is a military operation to eliminate, quote-unquote, the Free Papua guerrilla fighters, not only in Intan Jaya, but in several regencies along the central highlands.
In a development in the conflict, Mr. Hassono says Indonesia is now using drones.
This is something new. I think it will change the security situation, the battle situation in West Papua. So far, the TPNPB has not used drone as well. They are still struggling. In fact, most of them are still using bows and arrows.
Mr. Hassono says the Indonesian military operation is not only happening in Intan Jaya, but in several regions in Central Papua.
A new government report says that New Zealand police are not doing enough to support the fight against corruption and organised crime in the Pacific. The Ministerial Advisory Group on Transnational Organised Crime says that corruption and insider threats are on the rise, and the situation in the Pacific poses a massive risk. University of Canterbury Associate Professor Jose Sousa Santos says that the government isn't doing enough to engage with the Pacific on these issues. Kaya Selby asked him what more can be done.
New Zealand is assisting with the limited resources that it does have, but I don't think it's capitalising in its unique set of skills and experience. And I think this comes down to having frank and open conversations and identifying where does the Pacific want this assistance. What are the areas of importance for the region, and I think that'll also take a little bit of courage and intestinal fortitude from New Zealand, because it does mean engaging in areas which might be diplomatically sensitive, but for the good of the region and to be seen as part of the region, New Zealand has to take that stance.
So let's talk about what Pacific-centred looks like in kind of a practical policy sense. Does that mean greater engagement? Does that mean an input on policy decisions made in New Zealand? What does that look like?
I think it definitely looks on greater engagement and greater involvement in areas which would pay the greatest dividend to both parties. One of the biggest weaknesses that you could currently have in the Pacific is how to vet Pacific law enforcement officers, members of agencies. That is something that the region keeps asking for, is how can we assist in creating vetted law enforcement, vetted defence, vetted customs, which can engage with New Zealand and Australian counterparts at the same level with trust. Because currently, due to the lack of vetting, security vetting in the Pacific, intelligence cannot be shared. Joint operations are minimal. That does not only take away from mana from our Pacific neighbours, but it also compromises regional security.
So that recommendation provides support to the Pacific to introduce the same standards of vetting that we have recommended for our high-risk industries in New Zealand. That's something that would that kind of falls in line with that Pacific-centred approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. Exactly.
And again, engaging with Pacific experts who can contextualise that to cultural lenses which work on, specifically to each Pacific Island country. I think that is key.
So, based on what you understand about current trends in the region, the report made a deal out of the presence of Australian, New Zealand and American deportees in the region, and in particular with the US deportation policy set to create what they called a Pacific tsunami of deportees, many of whom are criminals or connected to crime networks. I'm just wondering if there's much, from what you can tell, acknowledgement of New Zealand's role in exacerbating this just because of the incidence of shared criminal networks and people there and whatnot.
It definitely is. I think, personally, from my own research, New Zealand's approach towards deportees in the Pacific is very irresponsible. We are sending some Pacific Islanders which have done time in jails, who have been incarcerated for serious crimes, who have been able to create links to outlaw motorcycle gangs, to syndicate, drug importing syndicates. And when they get deported, they don't have the same support systems in place. They find it hard to reintegrate back into the society and communities in their own countries. And some of them don't want to. They don't identify themselves as islanders from which they originated. They still identify themselves as New Zealanders. If New Zealand is serious about being a partner to the Pacific or part of the Pacific, it needs to ensure that the deportees we're sending back to the region have been rehabilitated, or we have at least attempted to rehabilitate them to the best of our ability.
Education advocates in New Zealand say a government decision to remove special funding for Pacific and Māori students in vocational courses harks back to the days of a one-size-fits-all education model. The funding cut applies to a per-student subsidy for Pacific and Māori enrolments at polytechnics and private training institutions. It is used to help fund dedicated support services for these students. Te Wila Fuatai has more.
What we've seen from history is when there is no dedicated fund, institutions deprioritise this work. They do what they are funded to do.
That's Sandra Gray, the National Secretary for the Tertiary Education Union, which represents staff working in polytechnic, wānanga, universities and private training establishments. Dr Gray says removing the equity support subsidy for Pacific and Māori enrolments is a huge step backwards. It also goes against official advice to Vocational Education Minister Penny Simmonds. A cabinet paper from January advises the government to keep the subsidy, which comes out of a fund of about $28 million. Specifically, officials say it should be kept to help achieve equitable outcomes for three groups of learners: Māori and Pacific students, students with low achievement levels, and disabled students. Now, the funding allocation remains for the last two groups, with the money dedicated to Māori and Pacific reprioritised, according to the Tertiary Education Commission. Dr Gray says the funding cut further hurts Pacific and Māori students who are already underserved by the education system.
What we do know with dedicated funding is that we get positions like a Māori learner support expert who comes in and works with Māori students, or a Pacific staff member who comes in and supports Pacific students. We know that there are all sorts of mentoring programs, guidance programs, including peer mentoring.
At Manukau Institute of Technology in South Auckland, senior lecturer Albi Fitisemanu says the impact of these types of support services should never be underestimated. Most of Mr. Fitisemano's students are Pacific and Māori. He says funding support services for these students helps ensure they get beyond enrolment. It goes towards student success, particularly for Pacific and Māori who often feel out of place in tertiary institutions.
The problem we're having now is Pacifica who enroll but very few completing along the journey, and so it's been able to bring in those supports all the way to see them all the way through their journey on out.
Labour's education spokesperson Shannon Horbert says the funding cut is part of a bigger sector revamp from the government, where references to the needs of Māori and Pacific students are removed from education legislation, as well as references to te tiriti or waitangi. Mr. Horbert says the removal of these initiatives goes against all the research on student needs.
If you look at where Māori and Pacific learners sit in our education system, they have the greatest need, and so the additional support is required to ensure that they're achieving what they need to, but also that they're staying within the courses until they're completed.
We also asked Minister Simmons for comment. She sent us a statement which says the government is working towards a more streamlined, outcomes-focused approach that supports all learners. She also acknowledges the advice from her officials, but says Cabinet collectively agreed that a broader reset of vocational education funding was needed to reduce complexity and ensure every dollar delivers results.
Mumbai in India will host the Rugby Premier League, which will become the world's first franchise-based Sevens League from 15th of June. Rugby India president and Bollywood actor Rahul Bose told RNZ Pacific that the event will boost the sport of rugby in India in more ways than one. Funded by the 6 franchise club owners and financial partners, the tournament will feature 30 international players playing alongside local players. All players and coaches will be paid a month's contract for taking part in the event. Elisa Tora spoke with Rahul Bose about the event and what it means for India rugby.
How important is that for rugby in India and the growth of the sport there?
Outside of the work that the National Federation does in the development of grassroots and the high-performance verticals of rugby in India, what a well-run franchise-based league does, whether it's in rugby or any other sport, is it creates 2 engines. There's an internal engine whereby in the quest to win the league title, the 6 team owners hire scouts, look for players, transform and create pathways for many more people to enter the rugby ecosystem as they used to earlier, and also give players who would normally never get a chance to upskill under the Indian national team environment will now be picked up. There is also an external engine to a well-run league, and that is, the numbers can be anything between 10 and 50 million for people to be watching the league in the first year. And whatever it is, it's still an impressive number. Rugby was never seen on television, was never seen on OTT, will now be seen in one of the best, most prestigious sports networks in the country, Star Sports Select, and definitely one of the biggest OTT networks in the world, which is the Jio Hotstar network. So that will create commercial interest in the sport. So between the regeneration and the rejuvenation and new talent, both on the field and off the field, happening internally, there will also be money happening externally. And when the 2 meet, that will result in a massive infusion of energy into the game in the country.
You've managed to secure a number of international players from around the globe, well known, who have been in the game of sevens rugby, to play in the 6 franchise teams and play alongside some of your local players, as you have alluded to, that have been recruited. What do you hope to achieve through such interactions?
Performance and culture. One is for them, for the Indian, the best of India, to understand how much further they have to go to become world-class players. So definitely performance on the field, nutritional, conditioning, rehab, habits on and off the field. I think that will be a huge learning experience for any of these boys. Psychological preparation, temperament, readying yourself during a match for the next challenge, readying yourself between matches for the next challenge. So all the mental and physical aspects of performance to look at the best players in the world. And the second is culture. What is the unspoken culture that is being cultivated amongst these players that makes them who they are? What are the kind of things they do when nobody's watching? What are the kind of things they don't when nobody's telling them not to do something? These are the things that build culture. So for sure, performance and culture.
The players obviously are going to be paid for playing at the event. How has the event been funded? Has World Rugby assisted in any way in financing that?
The entire league is privately funded. World Rugby has nothing to do. We have 6 franchise owners. Each of them pay a franchise fee, which goes into the central pool. Within the franchise fee that the franchise owners are paying is not included the players' fee. The players' fee is separate. The coaches' fee is separate. The transportation and living experience expenses of coaches and players is separate. Obviously, we have been guided by World Rugby as to what to tell the team owners, what they can spend, what they should be offering the coaches and the players. Right now, all the coaches and all the players are offered the same flat sum of money. It could change in the future, but right now, in the first season, according to the guidelines or the guidance of World Rugby, Rugby India has recommended to the Rugby Premier League Governing Council, that has recommended to the franchise owners what the amount of money that should be made available for a 1-month contract for coaches as well as for players.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.